As a brief introduction, Frontiers is the name of our CTSA, and we cover Kansas and Western Missouri. I know that there are people from across the CTSA consortium that registered for this, so that is very exciting. My name is Robin, and I administratively manage our internal funding programs, excluding the K&T. And I will be joined by Dr. Sanderson Cox. She is an associate director for Frontier. She's also a co-faculty lead for the pilot program. So today, I'm going to just give a little bit of background. I have a few initial slides. NCATS, as we affectionately call our funder, National Center for Advancing Translational Sciences, or Science. I will just briefly share their vision, charge, remind everybody about the translational science continuum. I have a couple of slides about the definitions of translational science versus translational research. And then the bulk of the presentation will be Dr. Sanderson Cox really going through each translational science principle, what they mean as defined by NCATS. And then she will be showing an example of previous work. Translational science isn't new to NCATS, right? It's a part of their name, but they've really pivoted to ensuring that all of our awardees, including ourselves, are actually describing what that translational science layer is. Following that, particularly because we do have individuals joining us from across the CTSA consortium, we will open it up for questions and discussion, and then I will end with some slides about our internal funding programs. So again, some of this you all may be aware of. My green pointer, it's so funny now that I'm in a webinar, it looks a little obnoxious, but so NCAT's vision is for more treatments for all people more quickly. That has been shortened in recent years. NCATS has always had a disease agnostic approach. NCATS is actually the newest or youngest IC at NIH. They were founded in 2011. I Googled that earlier just to make sure one hadn't been added, but I'm going to repeat myself. Always been disease agnostic and infrastructure, right? Those of you that know the CTSA program. Really looking at common pitfalls or barriers that exist in the translational process. And I am going to go through the continuum slide. And then this encompasses many of the translational science principles, but with an ultimate goal of developing innovative solutions to benefit research across a range of diseases. And I will say this a couple of times. Well, I was about to get ahead of myself, so I don't want to do that. Again, this is just a reminder for the attendees about the translational science continuum. I think in recent maybe year, they've added a T4, but many of you are probably familiar with this T0 or the bench basic science through T4. So the continuum describes the process of translating this basic scientific discovery into improvements in human health. So again, moving ultimately from the lab or the bench to actually improved health. It's a continuum because you can, I think that was just a hot mic, because it's a progression, right? And you can go back and forth as the science would move a particular research project. So I was about to get ahead of myself for a minute. So translational research and translational science are not mutually exclusive. Typically, you could have them, but in a lot of the work that the scientists that we fund and those around the country, they're going to have a particular research question, right? This has been historically for those that write, for example, R01s. So it is a process looking at a particular target or disease, right? What NCAT supports is research in the science of the translation. So ultimately to discover these scientific and operational principles for improvements in that translational science process, ultimately to accelerate improved population health. Oh, did I skip one? Oh, here we go. And then translational science is this field of investigation that's focused on understanding those very specific scientific and operational principles. Again, this will be the meat of the webinar today. Again, it's focused on a general case that could apply to any target or disease. So there's a research question underneath this umbrella of translational science. So the ultimate goal of understanding the inefficiencies, failures, barriers, and trying to eliminate those throughout the process.
So I'm going to take this from Robin, if that's okay. And then Robin and I will both field questions at the end. But I want to go back to this great picture that Robin presented, because when we are thinking about translational research, then as Robin was saying, we're saying, how can we move along this continuum? So for example, some of the work that I focused on in my career is advancing tobacco use treatment. And you may start either by identifying in the population that tobacco is related to a plethora of specific diseases. And you may identify that, oh, nicotine dependence is underlying that. And so you may go back to some basic research or some translational, early human proof of concept clinical trials work. You may then be developing pharmacotherapy, for instance, that's targeting certain mechanisms related to nicotine dependence. You may then be implementing those pharmacotherapies to see what's effective. And you may say, okay, well, great. Now that we have effective treatments, how can we move that into clinics? How can we make that more acceptable in communities? How can we reduce barriers in that way, right? And that's very specific to one area. In translational science, what we want to do is figure out how do we facilitate and accelerate the movement across the spectrum, right? So what are potential barriers that are holding us back from getting things out to the health of the community? Or how are there ways that by engaging community, we can help facilitate some of the science at earlier stages in the spectrum? And so again, translational science, as opposed to translational research, is more, how do we do translational research? How can we accelerate translational research? So what we're going to do, if we move on to the next slide, we have this great conceptualization from NCATS, which is this idea of what are the real principles of translational science? What are the sort of guidelines, the goals that we can keep in mind when we're trying to figure out what kinds of questions to ask to help us identify and implement really innovative translational science questions? And each principle is given a badge, and it's kind of a nice visual learning mechanism for us thinking about what these translational science principles are. And you could argue these principles are just principles of good science in general, but we're going to really apply these to examples within some of the work that we've supported to walk through each of these principles. So instead of just looking here, let's move on to the next slide, and we'll actually focus on one principle or one badge at a time. The first one is really identifying unmet needs. We want to be thinking about science that focuses on pursuing goals that address unmet patient and population health needs. What are unmet needs that we could develop some solutions for to either reach populations that we're not reaching or identify needs that have not been met yet, and how can we create solutions there. It may be scientific needs by making advances in under-investigated areas or addressing really unique research challenges. So let's move forward and look at a specific example by Dr. Robinson, who received one of our LSA pilot awards. And her work is addressing this very specific knowledge gap of looking at meniscus tears that were happening more often in females than males. And so she wanted to study this more specifically, not just to look at sex differences, but to develop and validate a testing system to look at how to control dosing of estrogen. So this particular example looks at approaches that advance treatment in this general domain, but also the validated testing system has wider implications. So it's not, you can use a specific area in your research to ask the question, but what you're really learning is going to have a much broader translational application. Let's look at another example, and this is the next badge, which is cross-disciplinary team science. So the real focus here is engaging team members with expertise across disciplines, different fields, even different professions or organizations to produce research that advances translation along the translational research continuum, right? So if you typically worked within, one of those levels on the continuum, how can you be reaching out to other investigators, potentially in other disciplines, to help figure out how can you really advance the science? This might include things like leveraging broad expertise, multidisciplinary research, for instance. It could also involve integrating knowledge by looking at concepts and theories or models or technologies that pull across different disciplines or fields. And then even within your organizational environment, you can be looking at how to enable team science. And sometimes that actually needs you to approach organizational and systems level changes so that you can make it easier for teams to be working maybe across departments, across institutions, but still be able to communicate, share instruments, share resources, and so forth. Let's look at an example of cross-disciplinary team science. And again, we can go back to Dr. Robinson showing that a given study does not have to address just one badge. You really are probably addressing more than one. And here's an example of integrating theories and methods from a range of disciplines within her work, and also looking at ways to proactively incorporate team science and enabling that teamwork to really further enhance the science. Let's go on to the next badge, which is a focus on generalizable solutions. Now, we care about generalizability in many different areas of science, but we're really talking about developing innovations that address persistent challenges that have stopped that translational research process, right? Barriers that exist so that we can overcome those barriers, advance the translational process. And that could be looking at identifying and developing or testing solutions to some of those common bottlenecks, common roadblocks that have slowed down projects in the past. They could be scientific roadblocks or operational or administrative in nature. And it's figuring out what is the solution, not just for the work that I'm doing, but a solution that would be useful to share with others because others might be experiencing these same barriers. This could be seeking commonalities across research projects. There could be a range of diseases or a range of conditions that could benefit by some of these same shared solutions. And again, sometimes these can be solutions that address barriers within our organizational environments. maybe related to organizational structure or ease of sharing resources and so forth. Let's look at an example. This is going to be from Dr. Nguyen and Dr. Farr from UMKC and St. Luke's. And if you look at this particular pilot award that they received, they're really looking at implementation feasibility for a patient decision aid for chronic coronary disease. But think about that. They're using chronic coronary disease as a specific example, but what they're really doing is looking at generalizable solutions. So how can a patient decision aid personalized to a patient's risk factors that aligns with their values and preferences, how can that empower patients to communicate more effectively with their providers? And that's the kind of generalizable solution that, yes, would be really important in chronic coronary disease, but also those lessons could be learned to really advance science along the spectrum in a whole variety of conditions. So that's why this is a nice generalizable solution example. Okay, let's go on to the next badge, which is really thinking about science that's focused on creativity and innovation. And I would argue that just helping us step back and change our perspective a little bit, thinking from, just not just, but translational research to this broader perspective of translational science, in a way is requiring us to use our creativity and imagination. But there's also some very specific examples of designing translational science questions that really emphasize creativity and innovation. And that could be in innovative research design, new methods to actually implement the science. It could be facilitating factors with the goal of increasing the impact of the research. So sometimes this might involve asking new questions, developing innovations and technologies. Sometimes it could be related to the process and the structures, the partnerships that we've been talking about. And then sometimes it could even be thinking of a new way to manage work within an institution, for instance. We all get into, this is how things have always been done. Well, let's move beyond that, because sometimes developing creative and innovative ideas can help us move our research along in a more efficient manner. So let's look at an example here for creativity and innovation. And here's a great example from Dr. Redmond at KU Med. She's exploring the role of music as a coping mechanism for prenatal and postpartum women who experience discrimination, stress, anxiety during and after pregnancy. And this is really innovative to be thinking about how music can help alleviate stress during pregnancy. But think about the fact that the work that she's proposing and the way that she is approaching the research and the questions that she's asking allow her to speak even more broadly. The methodology that she is using that is very creative and innovative could be translatable to other areas and other questions. And the findings may speak to this specific target, but also could be speaking more broadly in terms of addressing discrimination, sex, and anxiety in other medical conditions as well. So this is a nice example of a creative and innovative approach within translational science. Let's move on to our next badge, which is talking about efficiency and speed. How can we enhance the efficiency and the speed of moving along that continuum? And this could involve things like collaboration. How can we make it easier to collaborate? How can we make it easier to communicate, to coordinate work tasks, maybe to share databases? At Frontiers, we have the pleasure of having multiple institutions all joined together within a CTSA. And so we automatically have to think about how can we maybe be innovative and figure out ways to more efficiently work together across institutions. This can also sometimes be efficiencies in project management. What are some of the ways to utilize resources more efficiently or more quickly? And so it could really be across scientific approaches, methods, technologies, and so forth that really accelerate the pace of translational research. Let's get an example here. And I think a good example here is looking at Courtney Barrios, who also was a pilot awardee from Children's Mercy. And this is a really interesting project looking, actually exemplifying multiple translational science principles, but we're going to look at the general concept of how can you move from diagnosis to treatment more quickly when you're dealing with patient populations that have a number of barriers that get in the way. And so here, she's really looking at developing innovative solutions to facilitate faster care and access, moving from diagnosis to improved treatment outcomes, and how to do that in a more efficient, swift manner that is really beneficial to obviously providers, but also to patients involved in this area. And while her question is targeting very specific area, her findings are going to speak to research more broadly. So again, that's where we're thinking about translational science more broadly. Okay, in addition to efficiency and speed, let's move to our next badge, which is looking at bold and rigorous approaches. Of course, we want rigorous approaches in all the research that we do. But when we're thinking about translational science, we're especially thinking about ambitious research questions that use these robust methods to generate reproducible findings. And this could be producing, what can we really do to go after some major advances to scientific approaches that are really going to impact a paradigm shift? What can we do to ensure, in terms of rigor, that we are conducting the highest level of science that really maximizes the ability to reproduce our findings? So what are the materials, the research methods, the conditions that we are using that is going to maximize the ability to replicate these findings? Also that really enhance our ability to communicate our findings with our colleagues elsewhere, so that the work could not only be reproducible, but also can move further into dissemination. And sometimes some of this involves, again, looking at our own organizational environment and figuring out how to build an environment that supports this really bold and rigorous research. So an example that we would have here for bold and rigorous approaches would be Dr. Bantis at KU Med. And the scientific approach here is a method developed to determine cutoff points for disease classification using biomarkers and establishing what is optimal for decision-making. Now, in this example, Dr. Bantis is really advancing methodology. The findings are informative for clinicians and researchers to develop interventions and treatments. And so it's really moving not only something that's very, would you say, bold here, but really moving the whole method forward, so that others may be able to benefit from this established methodology and implement it in other areas as well. So this is a wonderful example here of that bold and rigorous approach. So now the last badge that we're going to focus on is this badge of boundary crossing partnerships. And this is helping us to, again, not only think outside of our lab and doing, multidisciplinary collaborations, as we had talked about before, but really thinking about what other kinds of partnerships could really enhance and advance this science effectively. So this may be leveraging collaborations across departments, across agencies, across sectors. Maybe this would involve government, maybe this would involve industry, to leverage expertise, to leverage resources to accelerate and push the science forward. This could also involve looking at patient organizations and communities as research collaborators. Not only sort of a community-based or a community participatory research model, but really thinking about collaborating as partners in really defining the needs and developing the methodologies and implementing this work to push the science forward. So let's look at a particular example from Dr. Vivian, who was an IAME awardee, and we'll talk about these different pilots at the end. But Dr. Vivian from Children's Mercy has a really interesting, very specifically focused pilot looking at Vichy syndrome, where he pulled together these cross-sectional partnerships. So involving the rare disease community, involving experts across disciplines from genetics, genomics, disease model development, drug discovery, bioinformatics, clinical pharmacotherapy, and lifespan research, to be able to conceptualize questions that are much more sophisticated that could be done if one was working completely alone, and also bringing in the rare disease community to help figure out not only what are the needs and the questions, but how could this actually be conducted in a way to be successful. So not only are we going to look at Dr. Vivian's work as a wonderful example of boundary crossing partnerships, but we're also going to use this work in the next slide as just an example of how one study really can address multiple of these translational science principles. So you might not be able to see all the titles again of the badges or the principles, but let's just walk through some of it. So at the very top, we're looking at an unmet need. So this particular example is focused on identifying new treatments for an ultra rare disease. And the generalizable solution is the next badge, and it's really integrating basic and translational and clinical research approaches to look at this example as a roadmap for also examining other rare disease and ultra rare diseases. Let's move down. We talked about how this is cross-disciplinary team science. We talked about how this is boundary crossing in terms of working, for example, with patient organizations. But at the very end, we see at the bottom the bold and rigorous example of identifying agents that enhance autophagy in preclinical models may have relevance to other diseases, which this also plays a role. So we may be looking at how the findings of one study can really speak to other congenital disorders and other conditions, and that one study, if the correct questions are asked and if the correct information, not necessarily correct, but if more innovative information is shared, it really can move the science forward, not only in that one particular example, but really broadly. So this is a wonderful example of these translational science principles. Okay, these are the examples. We're going to move on to show you again, here's the basic principles. And I'd encourage you to think about the work that you're doing, the collaborations that either you've been working in or that you have access to through your CTSA, or through other hubs and collaborations across hubs, and think about what is the work that you could be building next to really push the science forward. And again, from a translational science perspective, you'd be using these principles to overcome some of the barriers of translational research. So you're studying the science of how to more effectively move these innovations and findings forward. Let's open up to questions. And I know that we have a chat, And so you can always put your questions in the chat, but I would love it if you would also potentially consider just unmuting and asking your question to the group, because I think the group would be really interested. I know we have some folks in the discussion who have received pilots funding and are doing some really innovative research right now. And so the other option that we have is some of the folks who are conducting this research right now could give examples from their own work about what they're doing that is innovative and bold and using these amazing partnerships and so forth. Robin, I have a question for you, which is, as we've been, especially over the last year, spending more time thinking about wanting individuals engaged in the pilot work that Frontiers is supporting to really be thinking more broadly about translational science. Do you have any examples or of common questions that we've had from some of the, for instance, pilot applicants and so forth? Kelly, same thing I would say, or common questions that we've heard from people about translational science?
I will add that I have been very impressed with all of our applicants once we had this as a requirement in our RFA. I don't know if there was some previous knowledge or if this webinar that we presented last year helped. But those that applied even, and of course that includes those that we have funded, really understood what this meant. I did probably a handful of consultations, so brief meetings, just for some of investigators to talk through their ideas. But people really got it here. And we didn't, when I say here, I mean our hub, we didn't have a drop in the number of our letters of intent or full applications. So I was pleased. I will continue to be available as we move forward to meet with anybody, but yeah, I guess that's a good thing. There weren't a lot of questions.
I see Rayanne Anderson has her hand up. I would love to hear from you.
Hi, everyone. I'm a behavioral scientist, so I wonder if you could say a little bit more about what the T0 and T1 stages look like for behavioral scientists like myself, where, we're always starting with humans. I'm never doing animal research. That's
Well, so for instance, you may have some colleagues who are doing some behavioral work with animal models. And so that might be, learning and memory models, or it may be things like, for instance, pharmacotherapy, looking at drug reinforcement or looking at addiction, or, is what comes to mind for me as an example. But I think that, one of the exciting things in really thinking about translational science and just learning from our colleagues from other disciplines is that there may be findings coming out in some of those more basic science models that might really speak to you when you think about how you conceptualize some of the work that you're doing. Now, sometimes with behavioral interventions, there's not going to be a clear connection to collaborating with someone who is multiple steps apart from you on the work that they're doing. But sometimes you may even learn from models or theories in, other areas of work that might influence some of the work that you're doing. But I'd love to hear from anybody else online if they have thoughts for Rayanne's question. Or Rayanne, I don't know, what has sparked for you when you've been thinking about some of these concepts a little bit differently?
Well, I do think of myself as a translational science researcher, but within the kind of behavioral research arena. So I was trying to think challenge myself to think, what would preclinical basic science be when I'm studying rape prevention and trying to understand how often does sexual assault occur? And maybe my preclinical research is more the like measurement and how do we ask these questions accurately piece of
Well, so,
things.
and I would say that when we look at that whole translational science spectrum, most of our work falls in one place, right? Or maybe in moving from one stage to the next stage, right? So our message today is not to suggest that people should be encompassing the entire spectrum, but it may be, for instance, if like in my work, I can speak to, pharmacotherapy clinical trials that include behavioral components, right? We're trying to change smoking behavior and we're using some cognitive and behavioral therapy within our intervention to help change health outcomes. But we might benefit from thinking about how can we better engage community to speak to the feasibility of the work that we're doing, the implementation of the work that we're doing. And especially in clinical trials, we're always interested in having really heterogeneous patient populations, or making sure that if all of the former clinical trials have been done with a fairly narrow set of participants, that we can expand that. So a broader translational science question, like in my world, might be, what are effective ways of engaging participants into clinical trials, for instance, right? In the work that you're doing, thinking about who are the key partners, the key informants, who are the maybe community collaborators that might be really central to the work that you're doing. Or let's say the work that you're doing has certain findings, but you want to think about how can I move those findings out to who really needs to hear it, whether it's clinicians or whether it's community members or that sort of thing. The question of how to do that falls under translational science as well. And that's where it may make you think about innovative approaches or collaborations that you haven't had before, to be able to not only do the really interesting work that you're already doing, but maybe push it further. Maybe having greater, implementation or greater dissemination of your work in a different way than you thought previously.
Mm-hmm.
Or it may make you think the other direction of it may make you think, well, how does the work that I'm finding inform clinicians differently? How does it inform systems differently? And do I need to be doing some slightly additional questions if I really want to, make some either provider changes, systemic changes, or so forth?
Okay, thanks.
And that's just really sitting down, and that's the fun of sitting down with other people and kind of brainstorming some of these things, because what I just said might not fit with what exactly you do, but it's sort of a starting point to spark some of those conversations.
Mm-hmm.
I don't see any other hands raised right now, but I'd love to hear any other thoughts. And again, for me, when I think about how could I be thinking about my own work differently, sometimes it's an issue of approach and assessment, because I always have very specific, what are my outcomes? What are my specific aims? And they're very individually focused. But I am conducting research in a way that we could be asking questions about team science and approaches to improving team science in a way that we hadn't before. We could be looking at doing, multi-center trials that are connected together, figuring out the best way to share data, or to, manage protocols across institutions in a way that we haven't done before. And some of those things could be done right along with the work that I'm doing if I just added a few additional approaches, measures, or questions. Here's a hand from Ed Ellerbeck. I'd love to hear what you have to say, Ed.
Yes, thanks so much for this presentation. I've been struggling with the concept of team science versus team research, or translational science versus translational research for a while. And it really helped to have some of those examples. I was particularly intrigued with the work that Dr. Farr and her colleagues are doing at St. Luke's related to deployment of decision aids. So much of the research that we're doing, and I think even yours, Dr. Cox, on smoking cessation, one of the big impediments to getting our things broadly implemented is is our inability to influence doctor-patient communication in an effective manner, and that's broadly what Dr. Farr appears to be doing, which actually has big implications for developing learning health systems. And testing a variety of other behavioral approaches that might have to occur at point of care between doctors and patients. So anyway, great example. Excited to see where she's going, and I think there'd be a lot of opportunity potentially to expand that for future further directions.
I love that you bring that up, Ed, as well, because when you think about Dr. Nguyen and Dr. Farr's work, and that concept of how can these decision aids help with doctor-patient communication or provider-patient communication, for example. Somebody else who's not working in that area at all, I mean, they might not be working in chronic coronary disease at all, but they're working in something else, and they definitely know that communication can be a barrier. They might suddenly spark an idea based on based on one area of research and say, oh, wow, I could potentially use that methodology or that approach, or I could potentially try to develop a patient decision aid to work in some other area. And that's what's exciting about thinking about translational science more broadly, is because the work of one group on one project doesn't have to be as narrow as maybe we've thought before, if we frame some of the work and share some of the findings, disseminate maybe differently than we have in the past. Okay, everyone is totally welcome to continue putting questions in or to unmute and raise your hand. But Robin, would you walk us through some of the mechanisms that we have to support translational science?
I will. And of course, if somebody raises their hand or puts something in the chat, you're free to stop me. But this, let me get back.
I'll keep an eye.
Okay, thank you. It's timely, and the reason we've given this presentation when we did is that we are about to release our 4 of our funding programs. Again, this excludes the K and the T. So I just wanted to share a little bit of information about each of those. Our Lauren S. Aronson pilot is the largest amount of annual funding. It is up to $50,000 a year for each award, and we award up to those annually. You can see it's 2 weeks from today that the LOI will be released. But the priority areas for this pilot program are really broad. You'll see as I move forward, they're going to be more tailored, but this is the pilot program that all CTSA awards or CTSIs are required to have. So this could be processes or programs to understand and support the advance of translation, kind of what we're talking about here, right? So collaborative structures, helping develop a comprehensive workforce for a couple of examples. I should have started with all of this information is on our website as well. So following this presentation, you can go there. Another example could be data related improvements and tools, right? So electronic health record collaborators for a particular study, feasibility study, for example. Clinical research and clinical science improvements, so enhancing recruitment strategies, many of the things that we've talked about here today. Community and stakeholder engagement could be another example. This program does really align with our overall mission of Frontiers. So a part of that includes working with rural communities, but that's not a requirement. You can see the remainder of the dates listed here. And Lisa, if you want to interject anything as I go through these, please do so.
Sure thing. And I just put a link to the website in the chat.
Awesome. There might be some messages in the chat, so beyond yours. So again, feel free to stop me. But our Institute for Advancing Medical Innovation is called a Trailblazer. Their requests for applications are released at the very beginning of December. This particular program offers up to $25,000 for a year-long project, and up to 2 of these awards are funded annually. Their research focus areas are much more specific, right? So experimental therapeutic trials, the large categories, drug and medical device development, biomarker and discovery validation. Some examples of that would include like clinical validation of a drug target, or clinical pharmacology, so drug metabolism as an example. This institute is well known around the country, and they have done a lot of great work over the years. So we're excited that we have some funding related to IAMI, as we call them. I think I missed one here looking down at my slides, entrepreneurship activities. That's something that is very consistent with the mission of IAMI. So that's another, pretty specific area that this particular Trailblazer focuses on. And as a reminder, you saw examples from each. Intentionally, we put examples for each of these awards in the slides. I want to say one thing before I forget too. So those examples that we provided you today, Dr. Cox and I went back to funded projects prior to us requiring the clear delineation of what is research and what is science. So, right, we didn't ask those applicants to think about science, the translational science, or include that in their application. Dr. Cox and I went back to their materials, pulled out the examples, and of course got their permission to include them as examples. But it was just looking at what their applications proposed and, kind of aligning that with translational sciences. So again, one of the examples was our biostatistics, epidemiology, and research design Trailblazer. These will also be released in, this request for application will be released in early December as well. The BIRD, as we call it, Trailblazer, there's one of those awards for up to $20,000 annually. I think BIRD is maybe one of those funding opportunities that we offer that has really always looked at or had a lens of translational science, even if we didn't call it that, right? Developing new methodologies, for example. This program is strictly non-human subjects, non-human and non-animal studies. Typical disciplines are going to be biostatisticians, epidemiologists, bioinformaticians, data sciences, for example. And lastly, we have our integrating special populations. This RFA will be released at the beginning of 2026. I can't believe it's already October. This program is also $25,000. We have up to one of these awards annually. It is a little bit more specific in how we have written about it in, in our overall CTSA applications. But they're looking at, or will be looking for applications that describe consequences of maternal and fetal child health, looking at transitions of care across the lifespan, really incorporating participants who are older adults or rural residents in drug or interventions, and then addressing unique challenges of rare diseases. So again, much more of a targeted request for application. So that is it from me. I don't know if there's other questions that have popped in, Dr. Cox.
I do not see any more questions in the chat. I'm also just going to put in our general Frontiers website as well. So there's the funding link, but then there's just our overall Frontiers Clinical and Translational Science Institute website. We have all sorts of resources beyond these funding mechanisms. If you are currently working on an NIH application and you need additional assistance to strengthen that, you want to consider our mock study sections, or if you need some consulting from a biostatistician or someone who is a communication specialist, all sorts of resources can be found at that link. And please always feel free to reach out and give us a call. We're happy to help because we are here to help advance translational science.